So, sexist jokes work because we all understand, the cultural conventions of languages of sexism. Oppositional humor attempts to challenge those things, like attempts to make comedy out of the ridiculousness of sexism or the ridiculousness of rape culture. And I think that can be very powerful. I think poking fun at, male power, kind of broadly defined, can work, definitely.
Thank you for watching this video. Please help us keep the show alive by liking and sharing this video, and by subscribing to the show and making sure the notification button is switched on. For those of you who can help a little bit more, there's a Patreon link down below where you can contribute whatever you can. Every little does help, and all the money will go directly back into the show. You can also keep up with our latest content on Instagram at The No Show Pod, as you can see on the screen. As you know, The No Show is an initiative designed to make academic research accessible to everyone. So do contribute to the conversation, leave some questions, have a discussion, and I'll make sure I get back to everyone. Tanya, thank you so much for joining me on The No Show. I'm really pleased to have you.
Oh, that's great. I'm really happy to be here.
So you have a very interesting sort of area of research and sort of a position, if that's the right word, when it comes to sort of addressing this issue. And the issue is sort of sexual violence, rape, consent, and that sort of stuff. So before we get into your research and before we get into your expertise, what drew you to sort of doing this as a topic of your PhD?
Well, there were a couple of things. I think I'd been involved in kind of student activism and working, and particularly feminist activism, and had seen a lot of the problems on university campuses, particularly around sexual violence. And when I finished my undergraduate degree, I actually went to work in the community sector in women's health, which is where Rape Crisis and other services around sexual and domestic violence sit in Australia, which is where I'm from. And that was really interesting, but it also, it also led me to think that there were a lot of things that we weren't talking about in terms of sexual violence, and that the kinds of solutions that we were proposing, kind of we speaking widely as feminist activists and academics, hadn't changed that much from the 1970s, even though many of those solutions had been implemented. So for instance, in the 1980s, there were a lot of changes in the way that rape is dealt with in the courts that was supposed to improve the treatment of complainants or victims, supposed to lead to better outcomes, and they got implemented, but they didn't change things. And we were still kind of suggesting the same things. And while I was working in the NGOs and while I was studying, there was a very famous case, famous for Australia, in the early 2000s, which is referred to as the Bankstown gang rapes, or sometimes as the Lebanese gang rapes. And this was a case which got a lot of media attention and essentially became a kind of moral panic around the idea that there were groups of young Muslim and Middle Eastern men who were targeting white Australian women for sexual violence. And that was a misrepresentation of the reality, but that was kind of the reality that came through with the media. And on the back of that, there were all these calls to increase the punishment for sexual violence, which happened. A lot of anti-gang legislation went through. So on the back of those cases, for instance, the police were able to pull over any car that contained 3 or more people and stop them and question and search them. And the feminist response was really lacking, because all that people seemed to say was, oh, it's really good that people are paying attention to sexual violence, but we just need to remind them that sexual violence occurs across all communities and in all areas. And to me, that seemed to really miss the point of what was happening, which was that sexual violence was being used to mobilize not only really racist discourses, but also quite sexist notions of kind of white women belonging to white men, and that it wasn't going to work. you know, the idea that you could say, oh, it's really good, we're paying attention to this, we just need to generalize it, and that something more fundamental needed to change.
Does that mean that, or does this sort of, what you're portraying here, does that shine a light on the fact that in lots of cases, not just in Australia, but I mean, in when there was the sort of wave of migrants that flowing into Europe, um, there was these same narratives. Does it show that the media, let us just focus on the media for now, the media weaponizes um feminism to push racism?
Yeah, I mean, I would actually say I think that can happen, but it's probably even a little bit more than that. That if we look at the histories in the West of feminism, of racism and imperialism, they're very bound up together. So even in the US, you know, in the kind of turn of the century, you had many feminist movements where women were involved in ideas around racial purity, where arguments for women to get the vote, for instance, were made on the basis that why would you give Black men the vote when you wouldn't give white women the vote? You know, that's going to weaken the whiteness of American democracy. I mean, there's a long history of feminists themselves being either complicit or actively involved in racial politics. But I think also, if we think about the media, there is a really equally long history of using the notion of kind of violated womanhood in order to make arguments that are racist, in order to make arguments around increasing things like criminalization. And so the notion that men of color constitute a threat to white women, you see recurring throughout kind of colonial regimes. You know, in the US, it was targeted Black men, you know, in India, Indian men, in Australia, Indigenous men. And then also you have another example that the cultural theorist Gayatri Spivak talks about, white women saving brown women from brown men as well, kind of a justification of imperialism on the notion that white people need to come in and save kind of victimized brown or non-European women, you know, from their inherently sexist societies.
Is that, I mean, are these problems or are these sort of issues, um, do they correspond with the fact that white women are essentially the most protected race of women?
What do you mean by that?
I mean, in a sense, because it's constantly the sort of victim that has to be saved in the media, throughout your mentioning colonial history, um, is the white woman. It's never women. It's the white woman, or the white woman. So does that mean that there's an unfair bias towards white women when it comes to issues of sort of sexual assault and or sexual violence?
Yeah, I mean, I think there definitely is, and we see that play out in the amount of media attention that will be given to cases involving, you know, not just white women, but, you know, especially young, middle class, respectable white women, as opposed to other women. We know that when it comes to the legal system, you're far more likely to see a successful conviction if you have a victim in the case who is white, is middle class, is respectable, particularly if, you know, her assailant is not those things. If he's not white, if he's working class. But at the same time, you do see, as I say, these kind of parallel notions that white women are so liberated that they need to partake in the rescuing of women in other parts of the world. And so, for instance, you know, the very famous example of that is when Laura Bush went on American television to argue that the US needed to invade Afghanistan, you know, because they needed to protect the women there. So again, that's that kind of idea that saving women becomes a justification for these colonial projects. But I think, yes, you know, we can't talk about that without talking about race. And so that's one of the things I think feminists for a long time got wrong, I suppose, is thinking that we can talk about women without thinking at the same time about things like race and class, because those things are always in play together.
So it sounds quite. It sounds like it's a very problematic issue because, you know, we talk about these issues of sort of a colonial um, lens when it comes to feminism. We talk about a racist lens when it comes to feminism. We talk about a very biased lens when it comes to feminism. So does that mean that feminism in itself needs to sort of reassess what sort of protecting women is?
Yeah, I think so. And I think when we say that as well, it's important to recognize, in a sense, that feminism has always been doing that. And, you know, it has become kind of a cliche to say there's no single feminism, there's only feminisms. And I think that's really true. And it's also important to remember that in multiracial societies like the UK, like Australia, like the US, feminism hasn't only been white women. There've been Black, Asian, other minority women who have organized and who have worked with white women and have worked independently as well. But coming back to that question of the media, kind of what we think of as feminism, and what some scholars refer to as media feminism, tends to be this very limited perspective of a kind of middle class white feminism that offers very limited solutions. So if we go back to sexual violence, it's the idea that we can solve sexual violence through more policing, harsher sentences, those kinds of things. Whereas if you think about the way that the criminal justice system and the courts fail in relation to sexual violence, and particularly fail women who aren't white and middle class, then that means that you need to ask a whole set of different questions about what you might do to prevent and respond to sexual violence.
But then in that case though, because there are like there's a media feminism and then there are all these sort of diverse sort of I guess iterations or
Mm.
versions of feminism. How can we have how can we have a fair discussion about it? Because, you know, issues of women, say in the Middle East or women in South America or women in different parts of the world aren't necessarily the same issues that women in the UK face. So how do you sort of how do you filter out, you know, the problems of trying to like make feminism one thing, and then as a result sort of lower abortion, other white women go and want to use white feminism or UK feminism or Western feminism to go and save the world. So how do we address that? How do we tackle that? It seems like it's just too difficult a problem to solve.
Well, I mean, it is a really difficult problem. And this comes back to one of the kind of key themes in my research, I think, that, you know, it's the $1,000,000 question. How do we tackle it? But we don't tackle it by ignoring it or pretending it doesn't exist or thinking that we can just carry on as we are. And I think some of the ways that we tackle it, thinking about, you know, the fact that at times women have different interests, you know, it's similar to other global movements, like, for instance, worker solidarity movements, need to deal with the fact that the world is not equal. You know, not all workers sit in the same position, not all women sit in the same position. And again, to reference Gertrude Spivak, I mean, she suggested that some of the solutions are quite basic and they require, and also Chandra Mohanty as well, that they require Western feminists particularly to give up their aspirations to be able to speak on behalf of all women and actually learn to develop ways to speak with and among other women about priorities. And in a sense, you know, what we might say, to provincialize Western feminism, you know, and open up those spaces.
You have a book, so you published a book called Speaking Out. And
Yep.
Speaking Out, so first of all, just tell us a little bit about Speaking Out.
Okay, so the book came out of my PhD, and it looks at the kind of feminist belief that if we break the silence, we end the violence. So if we want to stop sexual violence, what we need to do is produce and disseminate and tell survivor stories. So when I was doing my PhD and I talked about the kinds of frustrations I had, one of the things that I was quite surprised about was that this idea that we needed to listen to survivors, as people say, was constantly reiterated, but that there wasn't a lot of work on what that meant or what the consequences were. So even basic questions like, what does that mean if different survivors are calling for different things? Who are we listening to? So what I wanted to look at was what that actually looked like in practice. You know, what had speaking out over the kind of last 50 years since the 1970s done in terms of changing cultural politics, and also what did the belief in it do in terms of feminism? So that was the questions that I had. What were the effects of survivor narratives, and what also were the effects of feminism seeing this as a central pillar that often wasn't questioned or talked about critically?
And one of the things that you sort of discuss is that, as I understand, is that sort of more problems come out of this approach than there are solutions. In that, you start to see sort of issues of shaming rape victims and that sort of stuff. So tell me a bit more about these problems that arise from this approach.
Well, I think, again, for me, it's important to kind of live with the complexity. So it's often the case, I think, in, the world, but also in academic work, where you're supposed to be either kind of for something or against it. And what I wanted to do, and in the end, where I got to with the research, was say, actually, speaking out is a really powerful tool. It managed to change the public discourse around sexual violence so it's completely unrecognizable. So before feminist organizing started in the 1970s around it, people really thought of sexual violence as something that was rare, that wasn't a political issue, that was just a matter of kind of psychopaths and criminals. Now, when women began telling their stories, they really changed many of the narratives around that. The issue is that it didn't change everything, in that we still tend to think of sexual violence, for instance, as a problem of kind of criminal strangers, rather than what it is most commonly about kind of families, partners, ex-partners, people that we know. So the stories didn't actually completely change the way that we saw sexual violence. And they also didn't, drawing attention to the problem wasn't the same thing as producing a solution. And it started to create other questions and issues. So, going back to the conversation that we were having before, one of the things that I found was when you looked at the kinds of stories that got told, it was, even in feminist spaces, predominantly stories by relatively well-educated white women who'd been the victims of stranger rape, that those stories were a lot more easy to tell. And that meant that the kinds of solutions that were being posed weren't being posed on the basis of most women's experience, and weren't taking into account things like, other marginalities. So what happens when you're a survivor and, one of your biggest problems is that you're also homeless? What happens when we think about sexual violence and the way it intersects with racism? Those things haven't been things that have sat at the center of the feminist narrative. So this was really what I said, it was a powerful tactic, but it was imagined to do more than it could do. And in refusing to question it, then it brings up these other problems.
So alternatively, would it, if you were to sort of to explore rape memoirs, or if we were to use rape memoirs and people speaking out, are you saying that it would do more positive if we were to sort of discuss the different types of rape and show the real sort of the real types of rape that aren't really spoken about?
Yeah, it's about thinking about the types of rape that aren't really spoken about. It's also thinking about, and this goes back to the point about the media, which stories get responded to. And this is part of the thing, feminists have chosen stories that, or use stories that generate public attention. And often those are those very particular stories of stranger rape, stories that involve women who are seen as respectable or innocent. And a problem there is that you can end up reinforcing those narratives. So I think you do need to talk about other stories, but you also need to not only tell stories of victimization. So Tarana Burke, who's the African-American community activist who founded the phrase and the movement around Me Too before it became a hashtag, she talks about these stories as what we do before we do the work. So in terms of kind of solving the problem of sexual violence, we can use these stories to draw attention to the problem, but just telling them, and particularly only telling a small subsection of stories, doesn't generate solutions. And that's been the problem, that we've imagined that simply telling these stories, even if we only tell a narrow subsection of them, is going to solve the problem of sexual violence.
With sort of regard, with respect to Me Too, how successful do you think the campaign was? And obviously, and what drawbacks do you think the campaign had?
Well, I mean, it's even, this is where it becomes difficult, because I think, you know, to describe it as a campaign, there's a question, you know, who was the campaign by? You know, what were the aims? What did it involve? And I think that where it was successful was that it did draw an immense amount of attention to the problem of sexual violence, and also at its best to the normalization of that problem. The fact that many women and men experience what we might call kind of endemic and low-level sexual harassment in their workplaces, in other places like that. But it oscillated between that and reinforcing this idea that the problem of sexual violence is the problem of men like Harvey Weinstein, you know, kind of men who are easy to label as predatory monsters, rather than it being a problem that's really endemic to our culture and that needs to be dealt with in that way. So I think it was quite contradictory. And what I say in the book about Me Too, and this is really what I think, is that in a way it represents the kind of limit point for the politics of speaking out. You know, it created this mass moment of discourse, this mass moment of public attention, this mass kind of idea that, yes, this was a problem that needed to be addressed. But it also showed the problems with just thinking that this outpouring of stories was going to automatically do that, because what's happened largely is, you know, a few men have faced consequences in various ways, and in many ways things, you know, have gone back to normal. And as other people have pointed out, it was only shortly after that that you had the confirmation hearings of Brett Kavanaugh, Christine Blasey Ford speaking. He still got confirmed despite that story. You know, that did it actually change the way we as a culture relate to sexual violence? There's actually, I mentioned Australia, there's a huge set of public scandals in Australia about sexual violence in the government there, at the very highest levels of government. And again, powerful men being protected. And so I think that it showed the limits as well. You know, you generate a cultural conversation, but you need to do more than that if you actually want to challenge and change kind of cultures of normalizing, excusing sexual violence.
But with the problem of power, would that always be there though? Because it seems to be the case that the powerful men are the ones that get away with it for the longest, or just get away with it or stop. So is it the issue of power dynamics that we need to address?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's completely true. And I think there's, you know, there's power at a whole range of levels. And this is where, you know, another area that I work on is about consent. And this is where I have a lot of problems with the way that we often talk about sexual consent, in that, you know, we talk about things like no means no, yes means yes, as though it's easy to say yes or no. And it's not, you know. And it's not just about someone who's really rich and powerful, but, you know, for instance, to be very cliched, you know, if you're a teenage girl and, you know, you think that, you know, you want this boy to like you, and you feel like he won't if you don't have sex with him, but you don't think you really want to. You know, there's a whole lot of pressure and power that goes in there that doesn't get covered by the notion of consent. And we hear women say this as they go through their lives, that, you know, they say, yes, they completely believe in consent, but, you know, that often they have sex because they feel they should, or because otherwise they feel like they would have led someone on. You know, so there's power at that level. And then there's power which comes back to what we were talking about before, that we tend mainly to believe and care about women who have more social power or more social status when they speak about rape. And we tend to excuse the actions of very powerful or respectable men.
Before we started the recording, you touched on a really, really interesting area that I want to explore a little bit, and that's sort of the weird position of comedy with regard to rape. And we've seen, you know, like famous comedians, superstar comedians across the board bring up rape in their stand-up sets, bring up rape in sketches and that sort of stuff. Can comedy ever play a role in the discussion, or is it always sort of does it always create more problems?
I think, I mean, this would be controversial. There would definitely be people who would say to you, no, it's always inappropriate. I don't think that's the case. I think comedy is important, you know, and actually feminists have used comedy to challenge rape myths, to challenge rape culture, you know, for a long time, for decades and decades. The problem is, I think, with comedy, as with many other things, is again this question of power, and that it's easiest to kind of tell jokes and have them, you know, land with a big audience if they reflect kind of dominant prejudices or dominant ideas. So, you know, sexist jokes work because we all understand, you know, the cultural conventions of languages of sexism. Oppositional humor attempts to challenge those things, like attempts to make comedy out of the ridiculousness of sexism or the ridiculousness of rape culture. And I think that can be very powerful. You know, I think poking fun at, you know, male power, kind of broadly defined, can work, definitely. I think most of the time when you see humor about rape, it's not necessarily done very well, but it can be used to open up conversations. So I think I don't agree with the idea that you can never make a joke about anything like this.
And I think this openness and this sort of open dialogue is what makes sort of these tools like comedy more powerful. As opposed to sort of, you know, there's people who are staunchly against it and say, no, you can never make fun of it and whatever. Because the reality is that in many cases, comedians don't actually make fun of the action, or they make fun of the power dynamics of it. They make fun of the that sort of stuff. Granted, there are people that sort of fail miserably.
Yes.
But the reality is that it does. I mean, any tool is a good tool if it's like contributing towards tackling an issue, and obviously sometimes, whether it's governments, whether it's comedians, sometimes people get it awfully wrong, and you believe that the tea and consent video was misplaced.
Yes. Well, what I think, yes, very simply, I do. So I know that a lot of people like it, but my problems with it, I have a few problems with it. And it's firstly about power, that point that I made before. You know, the tea and consent video, I think it's really interesting that it's based on two stick figures. So you can't tell anything about them. You can't see gender, you can't see race, you can't see anything at all. And that's not how we come to social interactions. You know, it's not how we come to sexual interactions. It's not that we're just kind of, you know, isolated stick figures with no social history and no social power dynamics who just say what we want and the other person says, oh, okay. So actually, you know, one of the things that's a problem for this model of consent being very simple is that in conversation, we actually don't tend to say no when we don't want to do something. And we often don't say yes when we want to in a really straightforward way. So an example is, you know, if I ask you to give me a lift to the airport, for instance, and you don't want to do it, you're not likely to say no. You're likely to either make up an excuse, change the subject, you know, I say, oh, I would, but, and then again, if you think about something like sex that has a lot of social connotations attached to it, if we think instead of tea, like cake or alcohol, you know, if you say to me, do you want another slice of cake? And I really do, I'm probably actually not going to say yes. I say, oh, well, if no one else does, or if there's some going, or sorry. So there's this model of communication that a lot of these kinds of things like the teen consent video presume around sex that aren't how we communicate about anything, particularly around something like sex, which has so many kind of layers of social pressure, social meaning around it, and where, you know, there's also a lot of gendered power dynamics. So as mentioning before, you know, often, particularly in heterosexual relationships, when you talk to women about the reasons that they agree to or do and don't have sex, it's often not simply because they straightforwardly want to, you know, and
And
it's for a
obviously,
whole range of
sorry,
other reasons.
just for
So
the benefit of the audience, the tea and consent video is basically a campaign that was pushed out by a particular police department,
at Thames Valley.
Thames Valley Police Department, and they essentially just said consent is just like tea. If you offer someone tea and they say no, that means no, and obviously, um, that is far from the realities of how
Yeah.
sex works.
And it's far from the reality of how tea works as well. And it seems bizarre to me that anyone would think, you know, when you offer someone tea, you're not actually just asking them, do you really feel like drinking this caffeinated beverage? You're actually, it's a social interaction, and it's the same with sex. And so I think the tea and consent video, by kind of trying to make out that things are simple, really gets the problem wrong. And so, and this is what, oh, sorry, that's my computer. This is what I was saying before. If we don't recognize that actually people find navigating sexual relations quite tricky with other people and difficult, other people can be strange and mysterious to us. People are worried about whether or not, the sex is going to be good. People are worried about whether or not they're going to be really respectful of their partner. Like, if you assume good intentions, sex can be great, but it can also be really confusing and tricky. And the other thing is, when we talk about consent, it doesn't guarantee that sex is going to be great. It doesn't guarantee that sex is going to be really ethical. So my problem in the end with the tea and consent video is, by stripping away the power dynamics, by stripping away the complexity of social interactions, it doesn't enable us to have a real conversation about why it's so difficult for us as a society to address the problems of sexual harm. Because if it was as simple as that video made it out to be, then it wouldn't be something that we've been trying to tackle for, at least 50 years. It would be a very easy to solve problem, and it's not.
Tanya, where can people find you online?
People can find me. I'm on Twitter at Tanya Serisier. I have a university website, which you find if you Google Tanya Serisier in Birkbeck, which is where I am. And those are probably, the two best places.
Excellent. And people can get sort of their hands on the book, Speaking Out, and just all the typical sort of stores online.
Yeah, that's right.
Excellent. Just one last thing. What kind of advice would you give to young feminists sort of wanting to come into this field, and or young activists sort of tackling this issue? What kind of advice would you give them when navigating the issues of sexual violence?
Well, I think I think that the first thing I would say is come into the field. Like, we need more people thinking and working about it. It's a really important area, and I think it's one that we need to think about more holistically. So that's the first thing, not to think of sex as though it's separate from the rest of society, the rest of social interactions. But like everything, it's part of our social dynamic. It's bound up with issues like sexism, racism, class. So that would be the first thing, that think about sex and sexuality as part of society, because it is. The second thing would be, when we're talking about sexual violence, we can't only talk about gender as though that's the only other issue. As we've talked about, gender interacts with race, it interacts with class, it interacts with, disability, it interacts with all kinds of things. And I guess the final thing, which is, I suppose, has been my real theme, is that part of, I think, the potential for changing some of the problems that our society has around sex is accepting that it's very complicated, that it's, rooted in kind of deep cultural patterns of behavior. And so we need to be wary of the temptation for kind of simple or easy solutions that, sound good when you first hear them, but I think don't actually offer us a way to really address the real issues and problems.
Excellent. Tanya, thank you so much for joining me. I've really enjoyed this discussion and sort of your very, very, if you don't mind me saying, well thought out and balanced out perspective on it. And it's really refreshing to hear that, because, typically these discussions are so polarized. And it's seldom do you find somebody who has such an erudite position on it. So I really appreciate your time.
Oh, I really enjoyed it. Thank you so much for having me on.
Thank you for watching this video. Please help us keep the show alive by liking and sharing this video, and by subscribing to the show and making sure the notification button is switched on. For those of you who can help a little bit more, there's a Patreon link down below where you can contribute whatever you can. Every little does help, and all the money will go directly back into the show. You can also keep up with our latest content on Instagram at The No Show Pod, as you can see on the screen. As you know, The No Show is an initiative designed to make academic research accessible to everyone. So do contribute to the conversation, leave some questions, have a discussion, and I'll make sure I get back to everyone.